Welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Philip Turl. Now, the largest flow of African migrants trying to escape to a better life in Europe is attempting to do so via only one country, and that is Libya. Although some arrive by choice, others come by force, and Libya is now described as a purgatory where migrants face appalling conditions, sexual abuse, torture, and becoming the victims of human traffickers. And that's before facing the deadliest stretch of the Mediterranean Sea. Conditions are now so bad that even the United Nations and the European Union are being criticised for turning a blind eye. To discuss this, I'm joined by Caroline Gluck, the spokesperson for the UNHCR Libya operation. Welcome, Caroline, to France 24. I'd like to start with asking you a very basic question. That is, why Libya?
It's a transit route to Europe. Geographically, it's close to particularly Italy. It's close to the countries where people come from, a lot of them from sub-Saharan Africa. So they arrive by land and they try to leave for Europe by sea, a short stretch.
And also, I suppose, the political situation, the unrest in Libya is helping because there is no organised structure to help them or to prevent them from leaving the country.
Hard to say if it's helping or hindering. The conflict is worsening. It has been since April. Things are pretty bad at the moment. You've got two separate groups fighting each other for control of the country. And then you've got many militia groups. You mentioned some refugees and asylum seekers being held in detention. Some of these are official, which are operated by the government, but many others are run by smuggling, trafficking gangs and groups. We don't know how many exist. We don't have access to these facilities. But I would say, in my whole experience, and that's decades being a journalist and more than a decade being an emergency humanitarian press officer, I would say Libya is one of the most challenging, politicized, complex, difficult and dangerous places that I've ever worked in my career.
Yeah, maybe one of the worst places.
Indeed. But it's not only difficult for migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. Right now, it's incredibly difficult for ordinary Libyans, civilians who are caught up in this conflict. Since April, over 150,000 people alone have been displaced in the Tripoli area. So every day is becoming increasingly challenging. Access and security is very difficult. A quarter of our staff, UNHCR national staff, more than a quarter of them have been displaced. They've had to leave their homes because they are living in high-risk areas of the city. So they've moved in with other friends or family, but they still do their job every day. But it's very complicated.
Of course, these are not just Libyan migrants we're talking about. They're migrants which are coming from all over the place, either from Africa or from the Far East or many other countries. Where are they principally coming from?
You have different groups. Some come as migrants wanting to work in Libya, and Libya has traditionally been a pull for migrant workforce. We estimate around 640,000 migrant workers are living in Libya. But as you said in the introduction, others are refugees and asylum seekers. These are people who don't want to live in Libya, don't want to work in Libya. They want to bypass Libya, and their goal is Europe. And predominantly, many of these people are from sub-Saharan Africa. Before that, countries like Syria, Yemen, countries in conflict, Eritrea, also Ethiopia, Palestine, Somalia. It's a mix of people. And the people, the profiles change month by month as well. We're getting more caseloads now, for example, people coming from Mali, from Nigeria.
Back in the time of the former Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, the European Union used to actually pay him money so that he would prevent migrants from attempting to cross the Mediterranean to Europe. Of course, Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown by the United States and the Europeans back in 2011. So aren't the Europeans in a way responsible for the situation that they have caused in Libya?
As you said, it's always been, Libya is seen as a frontline transit state, regarded by many countries in Europe as if they don't stop people coming from Libya, then they don't stop people arriving on their shores. So this could be one explanation for what's happening at the moment.
Do you think there's some kind of pressure that organisations like the UNHCR or the United Nations could put on Libya's rulers, although the country is divided between a government that is internationally recognised in the capital, Tripoli, then the Libyan National Army, which is in control under General Hafez of vast swathes of the country, to come to some kind of an agreement to improve the conditions for the migrants, because, as we just talked about, the political situation in Libya is so dire that, in a way, the migrants are the victims of a situation that they have no control over.
Well, first and foremost, what Libya needs right now is peace, a ceasefire. Civilians are bearing the brunt. And when I say civilians, that means ordinary Libyans. It means refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. Without that peace, we can't move forward. It's preventing aid agencies, including UN organizations, from providing help to reaching these people in need. And I think only when you have that peace in place, when there's a ceasefire, that we can move forward on other things, on improving the situation on the ground, including what's happening in detention centres.
Let's talk a little bit about the conditions that these migrants face in Libya. If we look at some of the reports that have come through, it says there they face torture, sexual abuse, arbitrary detention, a complete lack of human rights. And to make it worse, there are even accounts that the UNHCR, your organisation, and also the International Organization of Migration are absolutely absent in some of these areas. They're not providing the support that they're supposed to provide for these migrants. Why not?
Well, first of all, Libya doesn't recognise refugees and asylum seekers as people in need of international protection. It regards them as illegal migrants, people without the right documentation, and they can be liable to be arrested or held in detention. UNHCR is granted limited access to official detention centres run by the Ministry of Interior. At the moment, that figure is around 11. And right now, the number of people we estimate who are in detention, who are refugees and asylum seekers, is around 2,000. So the numbers have substantially gone down in the last year. We're not entirely sure why, and it would be speculation to comment on that. And we go to the detention centres to provide life-saving assistance. We do not condone the system. We have repeatedly spoken out about it, both publicly and in private.
But are people listening?
Governments. Well, one would hope they are, and maybe we can ascribe some of the numbers and the closures of centres and the smaller numbers there. Maybe we can ascribe some of that to our advocacy efforts to get people released from detention in an orderly fashion.
Now, there is this new UN urban assistance program, which is basically paying migrants to leave UN centres to sleep rough. I don't really understand what the basis of this is. It seems quite hard to understand that migrants are being actually paid to go and sleep in the streets, because that money that they're receiving to do that can also be paid to traffickers to try to get them across the sea to Europe. So it seems to be going against the whole idea of trying to help these migrants in the first place. What is the idea behind all of this? That's
incorrect. We have a facility called the Gathering and Departure Facility. It was opened in December 2018 as a transit site, and it allowed us to move people, the most vulnerable people who had been prioritised for evacuation or resettlement flights outside of Libya, to go there for a very short space of time before their flights outside of Libya to safety. And it worked that way successfully for many months until the conflict in Libya worsened. From July onwards, after the airstrikes on Tajura, one of the detention centres in Libya, we were forced to bring some of those people who had survived that attack as an exceptional measure to the facility. And then at the end of October, another group of several hundred people from another detention centre, Abu Salim, including the urban community, came into that facility. We made very clear to people at the time, we cannot provide assistance for you here. You're not, unfortunately, prioritised for these very few slots that we have. But if you leave the centre, we can provide assistance to you, like the 95% of our refugee and asylum caseload who live in urban areas. We can provide you with support. We recognise you've just come out of detention, that you're very vulnerable, which is why we can provide cash support for food and housing. We can provide medical checks. We can fix up appointments for our protection staff to interview you, to assess your needs and possible solutions. and we can move forward on that basis. We will treat them like the rest of our caseload. As I said, around 46,000 people are living as asylum seekers and refugees in urban settings of Libya. But we could not help them at the GDF. Now, since then, the GDF, the situation on the ground has got even more complex. At the beginning of January, 3 mortar shells were fired close to the centre, and some mortar fragments were landed inside the complex near a warehouse facility we operated. And then at the end of January, and I have to say the whole complex is rather large, it's under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Interior, military exercises were held there. This is at a time of war, of conflict. And this was a red line that we could not accept. It was jeopardizing the safety of everybody staying at the GDF, including our staff and partners. And we announced that we were suspending operations at the GDF with great reluctance.
OK, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Lots more to talk about, of course, in this subject. Thank you very much, Caroline Gluck, the spokesperson for the UNHCR Libya operation. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Interview from France 24. But stay with us because more news is coming right up.
Je regarde France 24 parce qu'en tant qu'étudiante en sciences politiques, ça me permet de rester à jour sur les informations dans le monde, sur les conflits, les débats politiques, tout ça.
الاختلاف بين فرانس 24 والقنوات التانية في المحتوى المتنوع وفي التوجه الأقرب للحيادية.
I like their coverage, especially with the news and the politics, but also I like the cultural aspect because that, me as a Kenyan, I get to learn a lot about Francophone, Africa, Francophone in general, whether it's in Europe or here, just from France 24.
France 24 m'aide à voir une perspective plus complète du monde et à comprendre différentes langues et différentes cultures.
France 24, with you everywhere, all the time. Liberté, égalité, actualité.